The cold wind seeped through the cracks of the city apartment's windows, but it wasn't the chill in the air that made Patience shiver. She sat on the edge of the worn-out couch, her hands protectively cradling her swollen belly. Tears streamed silently down her face as Solomon's voice rang in her ears. "I can't even stand to look at you anymore. You've ruined everything." The words hit her like a slap, each one cutting deeper than the last. Solomon, her husband, the man who once called her his queen, had turned into a stranger. His eyes, once warm and full of love, now held only contempt. The sound of the front door slamming echoed through the apartment, leaving Patience in a suffocating silence. She stared at the empty space where he had stood moments ago, wondering how their love had come to this. A sudden sharp kick from one of the twins brought her back to reality. She placed a trembling hand on her belly, whispering, "It's okay, my loves. Mama will protect you." But deep down, she wasn't sure how much longer she could endure the pain. The silence of the cold apartment was deafening, but Patience's mind drifted back to a time when silence was filled with warmth, love, and joy. Back when Solomon's voice wasn't cold, but soft and tender. It felt like a lifetime ago. Patience remembered the first time they met. It was a sunny afternoon in the bustling heart of the city. She was rushing out of a cafe with a stack of books in one hand and a steaming cup of coffee in the other. In her haste, she bumped into Solomon. The coffee spilled, her books tumbled to the ground, and she blurted out an apology before she even looked up. When she finally raised her eyes, she saw him. A tall, charming man with a smile that could brighten even the darkest corners of the city. "No harm done," he said, his voice calm and soothing. He bent down to pick up her books, one of which he noticed was a novel by her favorite author. "You have good taste," he remarked, handing her the book with a wink. That chance encounter turned into a whirlwind romance. Solomon was attentive, caring, and full of surprises. He would call her beautiful every day, even when she was in sweatpants and a messy bun. He'd leave little notes on her desk, each one a promise of love and a reminder of how much she meant to him. When they got married, their love felt invincible. Their small city apartment became a sanctuary of dreams and laughter. They spent weekends exploring the vibrant streets, trying new foods, and imagining a future filled with adventures and a big family. "Patience, you're my world," Solomon had said on their wedding day, his voice trembling with emotion. "No matter what happens, I'll always be by your side." And for a time, he was. Patience had felt truly seen and loved. Solomon made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. He would stroke her hair as they talked about their plans for the future, how they'd save for a bigger house, how they'd travel to Europe, and how they'd raise children who would grow up knowing the love they shared. When Patience found out she was pregnant, she was ecstatic. She couldn't wait to tell Solomon. That evening, she prepared his favorite meal and waited anxiously for him to come home. The moment he walked through the door, she couldn't contain her excitement. "Solomon," she said, holding his hands tightly, "we're going to have a baby." His face lit up with joy. He scooped her up in his arms, twirling her around the small kitchen. "A baby? Patience, that's the best news ever," he exclaimed. For weeks, he was the perfect husband. He accompanied her to doctor's appointments, talked to her growing belly, and even started reading books about parenting. He'd bring home little gifts, tiny socks, a baby blanket, and once, a stuffed bear he thought the baby would love. But as the months went by and Patience's body began to change, Solomon's enthusiasm started to fade. It started subtly. He would glance at her longer than usual, his expression unreadable. Then came the offhand comments. "You're eating a lot lately," he said one evening as she reached for seconds at dinner. Patience laughed it off, thinking he was joking. "I'm eating for 3, remember? Twins." But the jokes turned into complaints. "You're gaining too much weight, Patience," he said one morning as she struggled to button her coat. His words stung, but she tried to brush them off. "I'm carrying our children, Solomon," she explained, her voice calm but firm. "This is normal." Yet, his attitude only worsened. He stopped joining her for prenatal classes, stopped talking to her belly, and started spending more time outside the apartment. The memory of those days, the days when Solomon loved her unconditionally, felt like a dream she couldn't return to. Now, as Patience sat alone in the dimly lit living room, her heart ached for the man he used to be. She placed her hands on her belly, feeling the twins move inside her, and whispered to herself, "I don't know if I can do this alone, but I have to try. For them." The sound of a car door slamming outside brought her back to the present. For a brief moment, she thought it might be Solomon returning home to apologize, to tell her he still loved her, to be the man she married once again. But the car drove away, leaving her in silence once more. Patience's memories of the past were a cruel reminder of how much had changed. She closed her eyes, taking herself back to that fateful evening when she first told Solomon about the pregnancy. The moment she believed their lives would only get brighter. It was a warm evening in late spring, and the city hummed with its usual energy. Patience had spent the day at the clinic, nervous but excited as the doctor confirmed what she had suspected. She was pregnant. Not with just one baby, but two. Twins. Her hands trembled as she held the sonogram pictures, marveling at the tiny forms on the glossy paper. She couldn't wait to tell Solomon. Her mind raced with ideas about how to break the news in the most special way possible. She decided to keep it simple and heartfelt. She cooked his favorite meal, roast chicken with garlic mashed potatoes and steamed vegetables, and set the table with their best dishes. When Solomon walked through the door, she greeted him with a nervous smile. "Dinner's ready," she said, taking his coat and guiding him to the table. He raised an eyebrow, surprised by the effort she had put into the evening. "What's the occasion?" he asked, smiling. "You'll see," Patience replied, her voice filled with anticipation. As they ate, she tried to contain her excitement, but her fingers fiddled with the edges of the sonogram pictures hidden under the table. Finally, as Solomon reached for his glass of wine, she cleared her throat. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice trembling slightly. Solomon set his glass down, his eyes locking onto hers. "What is it?" "You're acting strange," he said, leaning forward with curiosity. Patience took a deep breath and slid the sonogram pictures across the table. "We're going to have a baby," she said softly. "Actually, we're going to have two." For a moment, Solomon stared at the pictures in stunned silence. Then, a wide smile spread across his face. "Twins?" he exclaimed, standing up and pulling her into a tight embrace. "Patience, this is amazing. I'm going to be a dad." His joy was infectious, and Patience felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the rest of the evening, Solomon couldn't stop talking about the future. He made grand promises. How he would be the best father, how they'd move to a bigger apartment, how he'd start saving for their education. Patience went to bed that night feeling more loved than ever. She believed they were stepping into a new chapter of their lives, one that would bring them even closer together. But the excitement was fleeting. The first few weeks were wonderful. Solomon accompanied her to her first prenatal appointment, holding her hand tightly as they listened to the rapid heartbeat of their babies. He talked to her belly every night, calling the twins our little miracles. He even started making lists of baby names and browsing online for cribs and strollers. But as Patience's belly grew and her energy waned, cracks began to form in Solomon's demeanor. He started coming home later, claiming work was busier than usual. When he was home, he seemed distant, scrolling through his phone or watching TV instead of engaging with her. One evening, Patience caught him staring at her as she struggled to get up from the couch. His gaze wasn't one of admiration or love. It was something colder, almost resentful. "What's wrong?" she asked, trying to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. "You're changing," he said bluntly. "You're not the same as you used to be." Patience felt a lump in her throat. "Solomon, I'm pregnant. Of course, my body is changing." "I know that," he replied, his tone defensive. "But it's a lot. You're not as—" He stopped himself, but the damage was done. "Not as what?" Patience pressed, her voice breaking. He looked away, refusing to answer. From that moment, things only got worse. Solomon began to withdraw from her completely. The excitement he once showed for the pregnancy faded, replaced by indifference or irritation. Patience tried to brush it off, telling herself that the stress of impending fatherhood was weighing on him. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. One night, as she sat alone in the nursery, folding tiny baby clothes she had bought on her own. She whispered to herself, maybe this is just a phase. He'll come around. He has to. But even as she said the words, doubt gnawed at her heart. The man she loved, the man who had once promised to stand by her side no matter what, was slipping further and further away, and she didn't know how to bring him back. The following weeks brought more changes to Patience's body and to Solomon's attitude. Her once confident husband, who had danced with her under city lights and whispered sweet nothings in her ear, was now a shadow of the man she'd married. Patience's pregnancy was progressing rapidly. She had always been petite, and carrying twins meant her belly grew larger than she ever imagined possible. Her ankles swelled, her back ached, and her face rounded with the weight she was putting on. Despite the discomfort, Patience tried to embrace this new phase of her life. She reminded herself that every stretch mark, every sleepless night, and every aching joint was part of bringing their babies into the world. But Solomon didn't see it that way. "You're eating again?" he asked one morning as Patience reached for a second piece of toast. She looked at him, startled by his tone. "I'm hungry. The babies need the nutrients." "They don't need that much," he muttered, sipping his coffee. Patience bit her lip, fighting back tears. She had always been sensitive to criticism, and coming from Solomon, it cut even deeper. She set the toast down, suddenly losing her appetite. Later that week, they attended a friend's party, one of the rare times Solomon actually agreed to go out with her. Patience had spent the entire afternoon getting ready, trying to look her best despite her swollen figure. She chose a flowing dress that highlighted her belly, hoping it would remind Solomon of the life they were creating together. But when they arrived, his behavior made it clear he was embarrassed by her. "Patience, can you sit down for a while?" he whispered harshly when she tried to join a conversation. "You're taking up too much space." Her cheeks burned with humiliation, but she forced a smile, pretending not to care. She found a seat in the corner of the room and watched as Solomon laughed and chatted with his friends, completely ignoring her. On the way home, she finally confronted him. "Why are you treating me like this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Like what?" he snapped, keeping his eyes on the road. "Like I'm a burden," she said, her hands resting protectively on her belly. "I'm your wife, Solomon. I'm carrying your children. Don't you see how hard this is for me?" He sighed, exasperated. "It's not just hard for you, Patience. Do you think I'm enjoying this? You've changed. Everything about you has changed." "It's a pregnancy," she shot back, her voice rising. "What did you expect? That I'd look the same while carrying twins?" "You don't get it," he muttered under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Patience stared at him, her heart breaking. She wanted to scream, to cry, to make him see what he was doing to her, but she knew it wouldn't matter. The Solomon she once knew, the man who had kissed her tears away and told her she was the most beautiful woman in the world, was gone. The next morning, Solomon left early for work without saying goodbye. Patience spent the day alone in their small apartment, her mind racing with questions. What had she done to deserve this? Was she truly so unattractive now that he couldn't bear to look at her? As the day wore on, her sadness turned to determination. She wasn't just living for herself anymore. She was living for her babies. That evening, as she sat in the nursery folding tiny onesies, she made a silent promise to herself. No matter how difficult things got, she would be strong for her children. If Solomon couldn't support her, she would find a way to stand on her own. But even as she made that vow, a small part of her still held onto hope. Hope that the man she had fallen in love with would return. Hope that he would look at her the way he used to and see her beauty, not just in her body, but in her strength and resilience. That night, Solomon came home late again. Patience was sitting in the living room, waiting for him, but he barely glanced at her as he walked past. "Where were you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "Out," he replied curtly, dropping his keys on the table. "With who?" "Just some friends," he said, shrugging off his coat. Patience felt a pang of jealousy. She hadn't seen him smile in weeks, yet he seemed happy to spend time with others. "You never spend time with me anymore," she said softly. Solomon paused, looking at her for the first time that night. "Maybe because you're not the same person anymore," he said coldly before disappearing into the bedroom. Patience sat there, stunned, as his words echoed in her mind. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the twins move inside her. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't let his words break her. For the sake of her children, she had to find a way to move forward, even if it meant doing it alone. Weeks passed, and the tension between Solomon and Patience grew thicker with every passing day. The air in their once cozy apartment was heavy with unspoken words and simmering resentment. Solomon's absence became more frequent, and when he was home, his remarks cut deeper than any silence ever could. Patience tried her best to keep the peace, hoping that Solomon's behavior was a phase brought on by stress. But as her pregnancy advanced, her patience began to wear thin. She was struggling, physically and emotionally, and she needed support. One Saturday, Solomon surprised her by suggesting they attend a family gathering at his sister's house. Patience was hesitant, worried about how he might behave in public, but she agreed. She missed the warmth of family and hoped the event might rekindle some of the love and partnership they once shared. The gathering was held at a spacious, modern home on the outskirts of the city. Solomon's sister, Miriam, was a warm and welcoming hostess who always made Patience feel at ease. As the couple arrived, Miriam greeted them with open arms. "Patience, look at you. You're glowing," Miriam exclaimed, hugging her tightly. "And twins? How exciting." Patience smiled, grateful for the kind words. It had been so long since someone had complimented her that she felt a lump form in her throat. But Solomon's expression was unreadable. He stood off to the side, his hands in his pockets, avoiding eye contact with his wife. As the evening went on, Patience tried her best to enjoy herself. She joined the women in the kitchen, laughing and sharing stories, while Solomon chatted with his brother-in-law in the living room. For a brief moment, it felt like old times, like she was part of a loving family again. Then dinner was served. Everyone gathered around the long dining table, passing plates of food and clinking glasses. Patience noticed Solomon stealing glances at her, his face twisted in what looked like irritation. She ignored him, focusing instead on the lively conversation. But as she reached for a second helping of mashed potatoes, Solomon's voice rang out, sharp and cold. "Do you really need more food, Patience?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Solomon, then to Patience, who froze mid-reach. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she slowly lowered her hand. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling. "You've been complaining about how tired you are and how hard it is to move around," Solomon said, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe you should think about what you're eating." A murmur of discomfort spread through the room. Miriam shot her brother a disapproving look. "Solomon, that's enough," she said firmly. But the damage was done. Patience felt tears welling up in her eyes as she pushed her chair back and stood up. "Excuse me," she whispered, walking quickly toward the restroom. Behind the locked door, Patience finally let the tears fall. She leaned against the sink, her hands gripping the edge as she stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was flushed, her eyes red, and her heart felt like it was breaking into pieces. "How did it come to this?" she whispered to herself. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Patience, it's Miriam," came the gentle voice from the other side. "Can I come in?" Patience hesitated, but eventually unlocked the door. Miriam stepped inside, her face full of concern. "I'm so sorry," Miriam said, placing a comforting hand on Patience's shoulder. "I don't know what's gotten into him, but he had no right to speak to you that way." Patience shook her head, wiping her tears. "It's not just tonight, Miriam. He's been like this for months. I don't even recognize him anymore." Miriam frowned. "You deserve better than this, Patience. You're carrying his children, for goodness sake. He should be treating you like a queen, not tearing you down." Patience nodded, but deep down, she felt stuck. She had no family of her own in the city, no close friends to lean on. Solomon had been her world, and now that world was crumbling. When Patience returned to the table, the atmosphere was awkward, and Solomon avoided looking at her. She stayed quiet for the rest of the evening, determined to get through it without another scene. On the drive home, the silence was deafening. Patience stared out the window, her hand resting on her belly as the twins kicked softly. She wanted to say something, to confront Solomon about his behavior, but she was too exhausted to fight. As they pulled into their apartment's parking lot, Solomon finally broke the silence. "You didn't have to make such a big deal out of it," he said flatly. Patience turned to him, her eyes blazing with anger. "A big deal? You humiliated me in front of your entire family, Solomon. Do you have any idea how that felt?" He shrugged. "I was just being honest." Patience felt a wave of despair wash over her. She opened the car door without another word and walked inside, leaving Solomon to follow, or not. That night, as Patience lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she realized something important. She couldn't keep living like this. Whether Solomon changed or not, she needed to start thinking about herself and her babies. For the first time, she began to imagine a future without him. The days following the family gathering were tense and filled with silence. Solomon's words continued to echo in Patience's mind, but more than the humiliation, it was the coldness in his eyes that haunted her. It was as if he no longer saw her as his wife, his partner, or even a person, just a burden he had to tolerate. But Patience wasn't one to give up easily. Deep down, she still held onto a glimmer of hope that the man she had married was still in there somewhere, hidden beneath the layers of indifference and frustration. One evening, as she sat in the nursery folding the same tiny clothes she had handled a dozen times before, she decided to try one last time to reach him. "Solomon," she said softly when he walked into the living room. He was scrolling through his phone, barely acknowledging her presence. "Yeah?" he replied without looking up. "Can we talk?" He sighed, setting his phone down with an air of reluctance. "What is it, Patience?" She hesitated for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I know things have been hard lately, for both of us, but we're about to become parents, Solomon. This should be a time when we're leaning on each other, not pulling away." He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "What do you want me to say? That I'm thrilled about everything? Because I'm not. It's overwhelming, Patience. Everything's changed." Patience felt her heart sink, but pressed on. "I understand that it's overwhelming. I feel it too. But we're in this together. Or at least, we're supposed to be." Solomon scoffed. "It doesn't feel like that. You're always emotional, always complaining. I'm trying to hold it together, but it's not easy." Tears welled up in Patience's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Do you think it's easy for me? I'm the one carrying our children, Solomon. My body hurts all the time. I'm scared, and I feel like I'm doing it all alone." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. For a moment, Solomon's expression softened. He looked at her, not with the disdain she had grown used to, but with something closer to understanding. "I didn't know you felt that way," he said quietly. "How could you?" she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been so distant. I miss the man I married. I miss us." The silence that followed was unbearable. Solomon looked down at his hands, as if searching for the right words. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. Patience felt a flicker of hope. "We can fix it together," she said, leaning forward. "But I need you to try. I need you to be here, not just physically, but emotionally. For me, and for our babies." He nodded slowly, though his face was still clouded with doubt. "I'll try," he said, though the words sounded more like a promise to himself than to her. The next day, Solomon made a small effort. He came home earlier than usual, carrying a bouquet of flowers, something he hadn't done in months. Patience was surprised but grateful. "These are for you," he said, holding them out awkwardly. "Thank you," she said, her smile genuine. For the first time in what felt like forever, they sat down together for dinner without tension hanging over them. Solomon even asked about her day, and though the conversation was brief, it felt like a step in the right direction. But as the days turned into weeks, Patience realized that Solomon's effort was fleeting. While he occasionally showed glimpses of the man she had fallen in love with, his coldness always returned. One evening, as they sat in the living room watching TV, Patience decided she couldn't rely on him to change completely. She had to prepare herself for the possibility that their relationship might never recover. Her mind raced with questions. Could she raise the twins on her own? Would she have the strength to leave if it came to that? She placed her hands on her belly, feeling the gentle kicks of her babies. They were her priority now. No matter what happened with Solomon, she would do everything in her power to give them a happy, stable life. For the first time in months, Patience felt a sense of clarity. She couldn't control Solomon's actions, but she could control her own. And she was determined to be the mother her children deserved, whether Solomon was part of the picture or not. Little did she know, her resolve would soon be tested in ways she could never have imagined. The growing tension in their household reached its breaking point one evening after Solomon came home late again. Patience had spent the day struggling with swollen feet, back pain, and exhaustion from preparing the nursery. Despite her discomfort, she cooked dinner, hoping it might encourage some form of connection between them. But when Solomon finally walked through the door, his face was impassive, his eyes glued to his phone. He didn't even acknowledge the effort she'd put into the meal. "You're late," Patience said, trying to keep her tone neutral. "Work," he replied flatly, tossing his jacket on the couch. She stared at him, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "You could have at least called. I was worried." "Worried? Patience, I'm not a child," he snapped, sitting down at the table and scrolling through his phone. Patience clenched her fists, trying to hold back her anger. "I made dinner," she said softly, placing a plate in front of him. He glanced at the food, then back at his phone. "I'm not hungry. I already ate." Her heart sank. The weight of his indifference was suffocating. "You could have told me," she said, her voice breaking. "I've been waiting for you all evening, Solomon. I'm trying so hard to make this work, but you don't even care." He finally looked up, his expression cold. "What do you want from me, Patience? I'm tired. I've got enough on my plate without you nagging me all the time." That was it. The last straw. Patience felt something snap inside her. "Nagging?" she repeated, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea what I'm going through? I'm carrying your children, Solomon. I'm exhausted, I'm scared, and I feel completely alone because the man who promised to be there for me has turned into a stranger." "Here we go again," he muttered, standing up. "Don't walk away from me," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "You don't get to walk away, not this time." Solomon turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "What do you want me to say, Patience? That I'm thrilled about everything? Because I'm not. You're different. Everything's different. And honestly, I don't know if I can do this anymore." The words hit her like a physical blow. She stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. "You don't know if you can do this anymore?" she repeated, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. Patience took a deep, shuddering breath, her hands resting on her belly. "You don't have a choice, Solomon. These babies are coming, whether you're ready or not. And if you can't step up, I'll do it without you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. For the first time, Solomon looked unsure, as if he hadn't expected her to stand up to him. "I need some air," he muttered, grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. Patience watched him leave, her heart breaking all over again. She sank into the nearest chair, her hands trembling as she wiped away her tears. That night, as she lay in bed, Patience felt a mixture of fear and determination. She couldn't keep living like this, constantly hoping for a change that might never come. For the sake of her babies, and for herself, she needed to take control of her life. Little did she know, the events of the coming days would force her to make a choice she wasn't ready for. Solomon's indifference was about to escalate into something far more dangerous. And when it did, Patience would have to find strength she didn't know she had to protect her children and herself. The days following their explosive argument were eerily quiet. Solomon's absence became more pronounced. He came home late, left early, and rarely spoke more than a few words to Patience. The tension in the air was suffocating, but Patience chose to focus on herself and the babies. She began to make plans in secret, small steps toward independence in case things didn't improve. She researched parenting classes, looked into support groups for expectant mothers, and even reached out to an old friend, Ruth, whom she hadn't spoken to in years. Ruth had always been the voice of reason in Patience's life. When they reconnected over coffee at a small cafe downtown, Patience poured out her heart. "I don't even know who he is anymore," Patience admitted, her hands nervously gripping her cup. He used to be so kind, so loving. Now it's like he resents me for being pregnant. Ruth listened intently, her brow furrowed. Patience, this isn't your fault. You're going through one of the hardest things a woman can endure, and he's failing you. You deserve better. Patience sighed, her eyes welling up with tears. I keep telling myself it's just stress or fear, but what if this is who he really is? What if he never changes? Ruth reached across the table, squeezing her hand. Then you'll handle it. You're stronger than you think. And you're not alone. You've got me now. For the first time in months, Patience felt a flicker of hope. That evening, Patience returned home feeling lighter, but the moment she walked through the door, she was met with Solomon's scowl. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone accusatory. "I went to meet a friend," Patience replied calmly, setting down her bag. "A friend? You mean you've got time for friends now?" he snapped, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Patience took a deep breath, determined not to let him provoke her. "Yes, Solomon. I needed someone to talk to." "Well, maybe if you spent less time talking and more time taking care of things here, you wouldn't feel the need to run off," he retorted, motioning to the dishes in the sink. Patience felt her resolve waver, but steadied herself. "I'm carrying 2 babies, Solomon. I'm doing my best. If you're unhappy with the way things are, maybe you should start helping instead of criticizing." His eyes darkened, and for a moment, she thought he might argue further. But instead, he grabbed his car keys and stormed out without another word. The following days brought no improvement. Solomon's mood swings grew worse, and his absence became more frequent. Patience began to suspect he was avoiding her entirely. One night, as she lay awake in bed, the twins moving restlessly in her belly, she made a decision. She couldn't keep walking on eggshells, hoping for a miracle. If Solomon wasn't going to step up, she would prepare to move forward without him. She reached for her phone and began searching for part-time work she could manage from home after the babies were born. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A week later, Solomon's behavior took a darker turn. Patience was in the kitchen, preparing lunch, when Solomon came home unexpectedly. She smiled cautiously, hoping to avoid a confrontation. "You're home early," she said. "I got off work early," he replied, his tone unusually curt. He poured himself a drink and sat at the table, watching her as she moved around the kitchen. The silence between them was heavy, and Patience could feel his eyes on her back. "You've been spending a lot of time out lately," he said suddenly. She turned to face him, confused. "I've only gone out twice in the past week." "And who are you meeting?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Solomon, I told you. I met Ruth, an old friend. Why does it matter?" His expression hardened. "It matters because you're my wife. And maybe if you focused more on this family, you wouldn't feel the need to go running to someone else." Patience stared at him, stunned by his accusation. "Running to someone else? Are you serious?" "I see the way you've been acting," he said, his voice rising. "Don't think I haven't noticed." Patience felt anger surge through her. "You're the one who's been distant, Solomon. You've been avoiding me, criticizing me, treating me like I'm nothing. And now you're accusing me of, what, cheating? How dare you?" The tension in the room was electric, and for a moment, Patience thought he might explode. But instead, Solomon stood up abruptly, knocking his chair over. "I'm done talking," he muttered, grabbing his jacket. As he slammed the door behind him, Patience sank into a chair, her hands trembling. This was no longer just a rocky patch in their marriage. This was a storm, and it was only growing stronger. She placed her hands on her belly, feeling the twins kick. "I'll protect you," she whispered. "No matter what it takes, I'll protect you." What Patience didn't know was that the storm would soon force her to make a choice she'd been dreading, a choice that would change her life forever. Patience woke the next morning with a sense of unease. Solomon hadn't returned home that night, and although she was relieved to have avoided another argument, his absence left her feeling vulnerable. Her mind raced with possibilities, most of them unsettling. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. Determined to protect herself and her unborn children, Patience decided it was time to prepare for the worst. If Solomon couldn't be the husband and father they needed, she had to find a way to leave. She spent the day carefully crafting a plan. While Solomon was at work, Patience called Ruth to explain her situation. "I can't stay here anymore," Patience said, her voice shaking. "I don't feel safe, and I can't trust him to change." Ruth didn't hesitate. "You can stay with me, Patience. My guest room is yours for as long as you need it." Patience felt a wave of relief. "Thank you, Ruth. I don't know what I'd do without you." Over the next few hours, Patience packed a small bag with essentials, clothes for herself, a few baby items, important documents, and some cash she had hidden away. She stashed the bag in the back of the closet, out of sight. That evening, Solomon came home earlier than usual. Patience tensed as she heard the door open, but to her surprise, his demeanor was calm. "I'm sorry about yesterday," he said, avoiding her eyes. "I didn't mean to upset you." Patience stared at him, unsure how to respond. His apologies had become a pattern, brief, shallow attempts to smooth things over without addressing the root of the problem. "It's not just about yesterday, Solomon," she said cautiously. "We need to talk about what's really going on." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know I've been distant. It's just a lot to handle. Work, the pregnancy. It's overwhelming." "I understand that," Patience said gently, "but I'm overwhelmed too. And instead of supporting each other, we're tearing each other apart." He nodded, but his eyes remained distant. "I'll try to do better," he said quietly. Patience wanted to believe him, but the weight of his past behavior made it difficult. The next few days were a delicate balancing act. Solomon's mood seemed to improve slightly, and he even helped her with small tasks around the house. But Patience couldn't let her guard down. She kept her bag hidden, ready to leave at a moment's notice. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. One afternoon, Solomon received a call from work and announced he'd be gone late into the night. As soon as he left, Patience grabbed her bag and called Ruth. "It's time," she said, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "I'll come get you," Ruth replied without hesitation. Within an hour, Patience was in Ruth's car, heading toward her friend's house. She stared out the window, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "It's going to be okay," Ruth said reassuringly. "You're doing the right thing." Patience nodded, but her mind was racing. She knew this was only the beginning. Leaving was one thing, but staying gone would be another battle entirely. When Solomon returned home that night to an empty apartment, he was furious. He called Patience repeatedly, his messages alternating between anger and desperation. "Where are you?" he demanded in one voicemail. "You can't just leave like this." In another, his tone softened. "Patience, please. Let's talk. I'll do better, I promise." Patience listened to each message, her heart breaking a little more with every word. But she knew she couldn't go back, not now. Not when so much was at stake. The following days were a blur of adjustment. Ruth helped Patience settle into her home, and the two women worked together to create a safe and supportive environment. Patience enrolled in a parenting class and began seeing a counselor to process her emotions. But even as she began to rebuild her life, she couldn't shake the feeling that Solomon wasn't done with her yet. Late one night, Ruth's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, her face paling. "What is it?" Patience asked, her voice laced with worry. "It's Solomon," Ruth said, her tone grim. "He's asking if I've seen you. I think he's starting to look for you." Patience's heart sank. She knew this was far from over. Solomon wasn't the type to let go easily, and she had a sinking feeling that his next move would be even more dangerous. She placed her hands on her belly, the twins kicking gently in response. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "I'll keep you safe. I promise." The storm wasn't over, but Patience was ready to face it. The following days were filled with unease. Ruth did her best to keep Patience's spirits up, but the tension in the air was palpable. Solomon hadn't stopped calling. His messages became more frequent, and though Patience blocked his number, Ruth's phone was now flooded with texts and missed calls. Patience knew it was only a matter of time before Solomon tried to find her in person. One afternoon, Ruth came into the living room holding her phone, her expression grave. "He's asking around," she said. "He messaged some of our old friends, saying you've disappeared, and he's worried about you." Patience felt a chill run down her spine. She could picture him playing the role of the concerned husband, convincing people to tell him where she was. "I don't know how long I can stay here," Patience said quietly. "If he finds out I'm at your house, he might show up." Ruth frowned, crossing her arms. "Then we'll be ready. I'll call the police if he tries anything." Patience appreciated Ruth's confidence, but she couldn't shake the fear gnawing at her. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally, and the stress wasn't good for the twins. That evening, as the two women sat in the living room, the doorbell rang. Patience froze, her heart pounding. Ruth stood up, her jaw tightening. "Stay here," she said firmly, walking toward the door. Peeking through the peephole, Ruth sighed in relief. "It's just the delivery guy." Patience exhaled shakily, realizing she had been holding her breath. Every unexpected sound or movement put her on edge. Later that night, as Patience lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. She kept replaying memories of Solomon in her mind. The warmth of his love during the early days of their relationship, the slow descent into coldness, and the recent anger that had replaced it all. She felt the baby's kick and placed her hands on her belly. "I'm doing this for you," she whispered. "No matter what happens, I'll make sure you're safe." The next morning, Patience decided to take action. She called a local women's shelter and explained her situation. "We can help," the counselor assured her. "We have a safe house where you can stay temporarily. It's confidential, and your husband won't be able to find you there." Patience felt a surge of hope. "Thank you," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I just want my babies to be safe." The counselor gave her instructions, and Patience promised to call back with a plan to leave. Later that day, Ruth received another text from Solomon. This one was different. "I know she's with you, Ruth. Tell her to come home, or I'll make her regret leaving." Ruth showed the message to Patience, her face pale with anger. "This is a threat. We need to report this to the police." Patience nodded, though fear gripped her. She had never imagined things escalating to this point. That evening, Patience packed her things again, ready to move to the shelter. Ruth insisted on driving her, and they left the house under the cover of darkness. As they drove through the quiet streets, Patience couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. Solomon wasn't the type to give up easily, and she knew he wouldn't stop looking for her. The shelter was small but comforting. The staff welcomed Patience warmly, reassuring her that she was safe there. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sliver of peace. But the peace was short-lived. 2 nights later, Patience was startled awake by the sound of a car engine idling outside the shelter. She peeked through the curtains and saw a dark sedan parked on the street. Her heart raced. It couldn't be him, could it? The next morning, the staff confirmed her worst fears. A man matching Solomon's description had been seen in the area, asking questions about her. "He's relentless," Patience whispered, her hands trembling. The shelter staff reassured her that she was still safe, but Patience couldn't shake the feeling that Solomon was closing in. She knew she had to stay strong, for herself and her babies. The storm was far from over, but Patience was determined to weather it, no matter what it took. Little did she know, the battle was about to take an even darker turn. Solomon wasn't just searching for her, he was plotting his next move. And this time, it wouldn't just be words. As Solomon sat in his car across the street from the shelter, his mind churned with conflicting emotions. He had been tracking Patience for days, using connections and bits of information he gathered from mutual acquaintances. His anger had simmered into something darker, a fixation on bringing her back, no matter the cost. "She thinks she can just leave?" he muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "She's my wife. Those are my children. She belongs with me." His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. A friend had sent him a message. Still nothing from Patience. "Maybe you should give her some space, man," Solomon scoffed, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. Space? How could anyone expect him to give her space when she had taken everything from him? He couldn't admit it, not even to himself, but a part of him missed the life they once shared. Yet his frustration and pride wouldn't allow him to consider his own faults. In his mind, Patience was the one who had changed, become distant, unrecognizable. She was the one who needed to be corrected, guided back to her place. Solomon's thoughts spiraled further as he began planning his next move. Inside the shelter, Patience found herself adjusting to the small yet supportive community. The staff and other women offered her a sense of understanding and solidarity that she hadn't felt in years. One evening, during a group counseling session, Patience opened up about her fears. "He's not going to stop," she said, her voice trembling. "He's always been persistent, and now it feels like he's obsessed." The counselor, a kind woman named Margaret, leaned forward. "Patience, you've taken a brave step by leaving, but it's important to remember that you're not alone. We're here to help you stay safe." Another woman in the group, Sarah, spoke up. "I've been where you are. It feels impossible, like they'll never let go. But you can get through this. You just need to keep moving forward." Patience nodded, drawing strength from their words. She was beginning to realize that leaving Solomon wasn't just about escaping him. It was about reclaiming her life. A week passed without incident, but Patience remained on edge. She hadn't heard anything from Solomon, and while the quiet should have been comforting, it only heightened her anxiety. One morning, Margaret pulled Patience aside. "We've had reports of a man asking questions in the area," she said gently. "We believe it could be Solomon. We're increasing security around the shelter, but I want you to be extra cautious." Patience's stomach turned. She had known this day would come, but the confirmation still shook her. "What should I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Focus on yourself and your babies. Let us handle the rest. If you feel unsafe, tell us immediately." That evening, Patience stayed in her room, her mind racing. She thought about Ruth, the shelter, and the twins growing inside her. Despite her fear, she felt a flicker of determination. "I won't let him control me anymore," she whispered, placing her hands on her belly. The babies kicked, as if to affirm her resolve. Meanwhile, Solomon had managed to gather more information. A passing comment from someone in their community hinted at the shelter's location. Fueled by his obsession, he drove to the area, circling the neighborhood until he spotted the building. He parked nearby and watched. He saw women coming and going, their faces lined with worry or relief. His gaze narrowed. "She's in there," he muttered to himself. He didn't approach the shelter that night, but his presence didn't go unnoticed. One of the staff members spotted his car parked down the street and reported it. The next morning, Patience was called into Margaret's office. "Patience, we need to move you to a different location," Margaret said firmly. "There's been a man outside the shelter who matches Solomon's description. We believe it's no longer safe for you here." Patience's heart sank. She had just begun to feel secure, and now she had to uproot herself again. But she knew Margaret was right. "When do I leave?" she asked. "Tonight," Margaret replied. "We'll take you to a safe house in another city. It's more remote, and Solomon won't be able to track you there." Patience nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect my babies." That night, under the cover of darkness, Patience left the shelter with a staff member. They drove in silence, the tension thick in the air. Patience kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see Solomon's car following them. When they arrived at the safe house, a secluded, gated property, Patience felt a glimmer of hope. The staff assured her that the location was secure and that she would have access to all the resources she needed. But as Patience settled into her new room, she couldn't shake the feeling that Solomon was still out there, searching for her. She knew this wasn't over. Solomon wouldn't give up until he found her. And when he did, she would have to be ready. For her children, for herself, for her freedom.